Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we are going to discuss about what and all a QA engineer or an SDET engineer need to crack any interviews along with interview questions and answers. Okay, so if you need this PDF, I have given a link in the description and also in the comment box. Please do check out for the link to get these notes. Okay, so let's discuss at high level on what and all we have covered here. We have covered about the manual testing concepts, Selenium with Java concepts, API testing with Postman concepts, SQL, Java programming concepts and coding concepts, Git and GitHub, Jenkins concepts, Jira, Docker, CLI commands, artificial intelligence for QA, miscellaneous and tricky concepts, and real-time scenario questions. Okay, so let's get started with the first topic, that's manual testing. Okay, so here we have talked about the categories. We have talked about in different categories. The initial set of categories is the basics of software testing. So we have talked about what is software testing, what is the difference between verification and validation, what is the software development lifecycle, and what is STLC, what are the different levels of testing, what are the different types of testing, what's the difference between manual testing and automation testing, what is a test case, what is a test plan, what's the difference between severity and priority. Okay, and then the category 2 we have discussed about the test documentation and defect management. That's what is the purpose of test documentation, what is a test scenario, what is a test case, how is it different from test scenario, what is traceability matrix, and why it is important, what is a bug or defect in the software testing, can you explain the defect life cycle, difference between defect severity versus priority with an example, how do you write a good bug report, entry and exit criteria in testing, about test summary report. Okay, so in the category 3 we have discussed about the test design techniques under manual testing. So what are the test design techniques, what is equivalent partitioning, give an example. Similarly, what is boundary value analysis, can you explain the decision table testing with an example, what is state transition testing, what is use case testing, what is error guessing, what is exploratory testing, what is pairwise testing, what is white box testing and how it is different from black box testing. And in the category 4 under manual testing, we have discussed about the functional testing types. What is the functional testing? What is smoke testing? And what is sanity testing and how it is different from smoke testing? What is regression testing? What is user acceptance testing? What is the integration testing? And the types of integration testing? What is system testing? What is an end-to-end testing and how it is different from system testing? What is exploratory testing and what is ad hoc testing? What is usability testing? Why it is important? Okay, so under category 5 we have discussed about the non-functional testing types. Okay, what is non-functional testing and how it is different from functional testing? What is performance testing? What is load testing? What is the stress testing? What is scalability testing? And what is scalability testing? What is security testing? What is compatibility testing? What is localization testing? And what is accessibility testing? Okay, and in the category 6 under manual testing we have discussed about the defect management and bug reporting. Okay, so what is defect leakage? What is defect density? What is defect clustering? What is a bug triage? What is a showstopper defect? What is a latent defect? What is a masked defect? What is root cause analysis? What is a bug life cycle tool? What is the purpose of logging defects early? Okay. Next, in under the category 7, we have discussed about the agile testing concepts. Okay. So what is agile testing? What are user stories? What is an acceptance criteria? What is sprint testing? What is continuous integration in agile? What is shift left testing? What is a product backlog? What is sprint retrospective? What is the definition of done? What is pair testing? And in the category 8, we have discussed about the test metrics and measurement. What are test metrics? What is test coverage? What is a requirement coverage? What is a code coverage? What is test execution status? What is test case effectiveness? What is defect removal efficiency? What is test productivity? What is mean time to defect? And what is mean time to repair? Okay. So next category, we have discussed about the common testing challenges. What are the challenges do you face in manual testing? How do you handle requirement changes during testing? And how do you test when the requirements are unclear? How do you prioritize test cases? How do you ensure maximum coverage in less time? What do you do when a developer disagrees with a bug? How do you manage testing under tight deadlines? How do you test with the limited test data? How do you report testing progress to management? How do you ensure quality when there is a pressure to release? Okay. So under the category 10, under the manual testing, we have discussed about the miscellaneous testing concepts. Okay. What is ad hoc testing? What is monkey testing? What is alpha testing? What is beta testing? What is installation testing? What is recovery testing? What is compliance testing? What is internalization testing? What is configuration testing? And the difference between static testing and dynamic testing. Okay. So this is all about we have spoken on manual testing concepts. Okay. In the coming to the next module, we have spoke about the Selenium with Java. So in the section 1, we have discussed about the core Selenium basics under Selenium with Java module. Okay. So initial question will be something like what is Selenium and what are its different components? What are the advantages of Selenium over other automation tools? Difference between Selenium WebDriver and Selenium RC, and the explanation of the architecture of Selenium WebDriver, and what are the different locators in Selenium, what is XPath and what are its type, difference between absolute XPath and relative XPath, and the differences between find element and find elements. How do you handle dynamic elements in Selenium? What are weights in Selenium and what types are there? Difference between implicit weight and explicit weight. How do you handle pop-ups in Selenium? How do you handle multi-browser windows in Selenium? How do you handle frames and iframes in Selenium? How do you handle drop-downs in Selenium? What is page object model? What is TestNG? How do you capture screenshots in Selenium? How do you run Selenium tests in multiple browsers? What are some limitations of Selenium? Okay. In the section 2, we have discussed about the Java plus OOPS concepts for Selenium. Okay. Why is Java preferred for Selenium automation? What are the main OOPS concepts and how they apply in Selenium? Difference between equal to operator and equals method. How do you handle exceptions in Java Selenium scripts? What is the difference between checked and unchecked exceptions? What are access modifiers in Java and why are they important in Selenium framework design? What is a constructor in Java and how is it used in Selenium POM? What's the difference between static and non-static methods in Java? What are Java collections and where do you use them in Selenium? How do you read the data from an Excel file in Java Selenium? How do you handle multiple classes in Selenium automation? Explain method overloading and method overriding in Selenium context. What is this keyword in Java refer to and where do you use it in Selenium? Can you explain the difference between final, finally and finalize in Java? And we have discussed about how do you use super keyword in Selenium. What is the difference between string buffer and builder in Java? How do you implement data-driven testing in Java Selenium? How do you use interfaces in Java Selenium? And how do you use abstract classes? And what is the difference between throw and throws in Java? Okay. And in the section 3, we have discussed about the Selenium advanced and WebDriver features. What is the actions class in Selenium and when do you use it? How do you perform drag and drop in Selenium? What is JavaScript executor in Selenium and why is it used? How do you scroll a page in Selenium? How do you handle hidden elements in Selenium? How do you handle SSL certificates in Selenium? How do you run Selenium tests in headless mode? How do you handle file uploads in Selenium? How do you handle file downloads in Selenium? How do you handle browser notifications in Selenium? How do you run parallel tests in Selenium? How do you use Selenium grid? What's the difference between driver.close and driver.quit? How do you capture network traffic in Selenium? How do you handle cookies in Selenium? How do you maximize and resize browser windows in Selenium? How do you verify tooltips in Selenium? How do you take full page screenshot in Selenium? How do you handle shadow DOM elements in Selenium? How do you handle stale element exceptions in Selenium? Okay, so these are some of the important topics on Selenium advanced and WebDriver related. Okay, so the next section talks about automation frameworks and tool. Okay, what is an automation framework and why it is important in Selenium projects? What are the different types of Selenium automation frameworks? What is TestNG and why it is preferred over JUnit? Explain the TestNG annotations in Selenium. How do you implement data-driven testing in Selenium? How do you run tests in multiple browsers using TestNG? What is Maven and how it is used? How do you create a page object model in Selenium? What is Page Factory in Selenium? What is Cucumber and why it is used with Selenium? Can you explain the structure of a Cucumber project? Explain what is extent reports and how do you use it in Selenium? How do you integrate Selenium tests with Jenkins? How do you use Git with Selenium projects? What is CI/CD and why it is important in automation? How do you how do you parameterize tests in Cucumber? How do you run Cucumber tests in parallel? What is the difference between JUnit and TestNG in Selenium? How do you generate HTML reports in TestNG? How do you create a hybrid framework in Selenium? Okay, so in the section 5 we have talked about the real-time scenarios, best practices and troubleshooting. Okay, in your Selenium project, how do you decide what to automate and what not to automate? How do you handle dynamic waits in Selenium slow loading web application? What would you do if click is not working on a button? How do you automate CAPTCHA in Selenium? How do you handle elements inside multiple nested frames, iframes? How do you handle element click intercepted exception? What's your approach to debugging a failed Selenium test? How do you avoid flaky tests in Selenium? How do you handle a stale element after a page refresh? How do you capture logs from browser console? How do you run Selenium tests in Docker? How do you integrate API testing with Selenium UI tests? How do you measure page load time in Selenium? How do you test responsive design in Selenium? How do you take screenshots only on the test failures? How do you avoid running all tests only when only one fails in a suite? How do you run Selenium tests without installing a browser locally? How do you validate broken links in Selenium? How do you test file uploads in remote execution? What's your test strategy when Selenium cannot automate a specific step? Okay, so and then next module is about API testing with Postman. Initially, we'll speak about API basics and fundamentals. What is we spoke about what is API testing and why it is important. What are the different types of APIs? What is the difference between SOAP and REST API? Explain HTTP methods in API testing. What is idempotency in HTTP methods? What's the difference between URI, URL and endpoint? What are the categories of HTTP status codes? What are headers in API request and responses? What is JSON and why it is preferred over XML? How do you validate an API response? Okay, and in the next section we have spoke about Postman features and usage. What is Postman and why it is widely used? Explain the structure of a request in Postman. What are Postman collections and why they are important? What are environments in Postman? What are variables in Postman and how do you use them? What's the difference between pre-request script and test in Postman? How do you write a basic test script in Postman? How do you send authentication credentials in Postman? What is a collection runner in Postman? What is a Newman? How do you handle dynamic data in Postman test? How do you import or export collections and environments in Postman? What is a monitor in Postman? How do you validate JSON schema in Postman? How do you pass query parameters in Postman? Okay. So, and next section we have spoke about the API testing in depth. Okay. How do you approach testing a new API when no documentation is available? What are the most common API testing validations? How do you test API error handling? What is the difference between functional and non-functional API testing? How do you validate data integrity in API testing? How do you test API security in Postman? How do you test an API for performance using Postman? How do you chain API requests in Postman? How do you test APIs that have dependencies on other services? How do you handle dynamic tokens or session IDs in Postman? How do you ensure API backward compatibility? How do you test API pagination? How do you test sorting and filtering in APIs? How do you validate API contracts? How do you test APIs that return asynchronous responses? And in the next section, we have spoke about scripting and automation in Postman. What scripting language does Postman use for automation? How do you store and use dynamic values across requests? How do you run data-driven tests in Postman? How do you write assertions for status codes and response time? How do you validate JSON response body in Postman? How do you validate a JSON schema in Postman tests? How do you log output to Postman console? How do you handle loops in Postman scripts? How do you call one request from another in Postman? How do you generate random test data in Postman? How do you handle conditional testing in Postman scripts? How do you automate Postman tests in CI/CD pipelines? How do you capture values from headers in Postman? How do you validate arrays in Postman response? How do you run only selected tests in Postman collection? How do you use environment variables in scripts? How do you parameterize requests in Postman? How do you run Postman tests headlessly? How do you retry failed requests in Postman scripts? How do you test APIs with file uploads in Postman? And in the next section, we have talked about the advanced testing scenarios. How do you test versioned APIs? How do you test APIs in a microservices architecture? How do you test APIs that run asynchronous results? How do you test APIs with third-party integrations? How do you test API rate limiting? How do you test webhooks in Postman? How do you test GraphQL APIs in Postman? How do you test APIs with file downloads? How do you test APIs that require digital signatures? How do you mock APIs in Postman? How do you handle API request sequencing in Postman? How do you test APIs that have different behavior for different users? How do you test an API migration from monolithic to microservices? How do you test an API that returns streaming data? How do you test APIs with scheduled jobs? How do you handle flaky APIs in automation? How do you test localization in APIs? How do you validate API caching behavior? How do you test APIs under failure scenarios? How do you test gRPC APIs in Postman? Okay. And in the next section, we have talked about CI/CD and integration testing. Okay, how do you integrate Postman tests into CI/CD pipelines? What is Newman and why it is used? How do you generate HTML reports from Newman? How do you schedule Postman collections to run automatically? How do you pass dynamic environment variables in CI/CD? How do you run specific folders or request from a collection in CI/CD? Excuse me guys, I'll drink some water. Okay, how do you integrate Postman with the version control? How do you test APIs automatically after deployment? How do you run Postman collections in parallel? How do you publish API test results to a dashboard? And what are the best practices and common pitfalls? What are API testing best practices? How do you ensure API tests are maintainable? What is schema validation? What's the difference between smoke, regression and load testing in APIs? What are common mistakes in Postman testing? How do you handle API security testing in Postman? How do you manage large Postman collections efficiently? How do you test APIs with complex JSON structures? How do you keep Postman environments in sync across teams? If an API test fails in CI/CD, how do you troubleshoot? Okay, so next we have spoke about the SQL. What is SQL and why it is important for a QA engineer? Difference between delete, truncate and drop. What is a primary key? Can a table have multiple primary keys? What is foreign key and its importance? Difference between all types of joins. How to find the duplicate records in a given table. Difference between where and having clause. How do you find the second highest salary from a table? How do you update multiple columns in a single query? What is normalization and why it is important in databases? What's denormalization? How do you get the count of rows without using count of star? What's the difference between union and union all? How do you retrieve top 5 records from a table? How do you check for null values in SQL? How do you replace null values with a default value? What's the difference between char and varchar? And how do you retrieve the last inserted record? What is an index in SQL? How to find the total salary of each department? How do you fetch all the records where a column contains a specific substring? How do you find employees who don't have any orders? How do you retrieve distinct departments names from the table? What's the difference between and in? And how do you find the number of employees hired each year? How do you select records with salaries higher than the department average? What is a self join and why it is used? How do you get all records except the highest salary? What is a correlated subquery? How do you check if two tables have the same data? How do you find employees whose salary is within the top 3 highest salaries in the company? How do you check if a table has any rows without fetching the data? What's the difference between exists and in? How do you get the difference between two dates in SQL? How do you find the highest salary in each department? What is view in SQL? How do you find the records present in one table but not in other table? How do you select random rows from a table? How do you check for duplicate rows based on multiple columns? How do you delete duplicate rows but keep only one instance? How do you convert a string to uppercase in SQL? How do you find the length of a string in SQL? How do you find all employees hired in the last 30 days? How do you use a case statement in SQL? How do you handle special characters in SQL queries? How do you select only numeric values from a column containing mixed data? How do you join more than two tables in SQL? How do you pivot data in SQL? And how do you handle transactions in SQL for testing? What are stored procedures? Okay, so and then the next topic we have spoken about the Java basics. What is Java and how it is important for automation testing? What's the difference between JDK, JRE and JVM? What are Java data types and how are they used in automation? What are the differences between primitive and reference data types? What are Java operators? Okay, explain conditional statements in Java. What is the difference between if else and switch case? What are loops in Java and how are they used in QA? What's the difference between break and continuous loops? What is an array in Java? What's the difference between array and array list in Java? Why is a string in Java and what is a string in Java and why it is immutable? Difference between string builder and string buffer. What is object oriented programming in Java? Can you explain the encapsulation, inheritance, polymorphism, abstraction, and the differences between abstract class and interface? What is method overloading and method overriding? What is the difference between final, finally, and finalize? What is exception handling in Java? What's the difference between checked and unchecked exceptions? What is a wrapper class in Java? What is autoboxing and unboxing? What are collections in Java? What are the differences between list and set? What is the difference between hash map and hash set? How to iterate over a collection? What's the difference between array list and linked list? What is hash map? What is synchronization? How is multi-threading used in automation? What's the difference between throw and throws? What's the difference between equal to and equals method? What are static methods and variables? What are constructors in Java? Differences between default and parameterized constructors. What is this keyword in Java? Super keyword in Java. What is file handling in Java? How to read a file, how to write into a file, what is deserialization, what is serialization, and what are Java streams, difference between lambda expressions and anonymous class, how to handle dates, how to regenerate random data, how is Java integrated in Selenium automation. Okay, and then these are some of the Java coding programs. Okay, reverse a string, check if the string is a palindrome, count the vowels in a given string, swap two numbers without using temporary variable, find factorial of a number, Fibonacci series, and find largest number in a given array, try to reverse an array, count words in a string, remove duplicates from an array, find duplicate elements in an array, check prime number, reverse words in a sentence, check anagram strings, find second largest number, find the sum of digits, remove white spaces from a given string, convert string to integer, find missing number in an array, or read the file and print the content. Okay, so next set of interview questions are based on Git and GitHub. What is Git and why it is important? Difference between Git and GitHub. Explain the Git branching model for QA. How do you resolve merge conflicts in Git? And how do you revert a commit without losing history? Difference between Git merge and Git rebase. How to clone a repository from a GitHub. What is pull request and why QA uses it? How to stash changes in Git. Explain Git tags and QA usage. What's the difference between Git fetch and Git pull? How do you view commit history in Git? How do you create and switch to a new branch in Git? And how do you delete a branch in Git? How do you see differences between two commits? How do you undo the last commit but keep the changes? What is .git ignore and why QA uses it? How do you check which branch you are on? How to rename a branch? How do you see who made the changes to a file? Okay, and the next module is about CI/CD pipelines. What is CI/CD? Difference between continuous delivery and continuous deployment. And what is the role of QA in CI/CD pipeline? How does CI/CD improve software quality for QA teams? What are quality gates in CI/CD? How do you integrate automated tests in CI/CD pipeline? How do you trigger a CI/CD pipeline automatically after code changes? What are common stages of CI/CD pipeline from a QA perspective? What is a blue-green deployment and how does it help QA? How do you handle flaky tests in CI/CD pipelines? What tools can be used for CI/CD in QA automation? How do you run parallel tests in CI/CD? How do you generate and share test reports in CI/CD? How do you manage test data in CI/CD? And what's the difference between CI/CD for backend APIs and front-end UI testing? In the next section, we have spoke about what Jenkins. Okay, what is Jenkins? Why it is important? And how do you create a basic Jenkins job to run automation tests? What is the difference between a freestyle job and a pipeline job in Jenkins? How do you configure Jenkins to trigger builds automatically from GitHub? How do you integrate Selenium tests with Jenkins? How do you parameterize a Jenkins build for QA testing? What is a Jenkins file and why QA uses it? How do you run tests in parallel in Jenkins? How do you integrate Postman API tests with Jenkins? How do you schedule a nightly regression run in Jenkins? How do you publish HTML test reports? How do you handle failed builds in Jenkins for QA tests? How do you use Jenkins to test across multiple environments? How do you secure Jenkins for QA projects? How do you archive test artifacts in Java in Jenkins? Okay, and in the next section we have spoken about the Jira. What is Jira? What is an issue with the Jira? What is a workflow? How do you create a bug? Difference between priority and severity in Jira. How do QA engineers use Jira for agile testing? Can Jira be used for test case management? How do you link issues in Jira? What are Jira filters? How do you generate reports in Jira? Okay, and in the next section we have spoken about the Docker. What is a Docker? Difference between Docker and virtual machines. What is a Docker image and container and how they are different? How do you create and run a Docker container for automation testing? What is Docker Hub and how do QA engineers use it? How to write a Docker file for QA automation projects? How do you share test environments using Docker Compose? Difference between Docker run and Docker X. Okay, and then execution command. How do you persist test results in Docker container? How do you optimize Docker images for faster pipeline execution? How do you debug test failures in Docker containers? How do you integrate Docker with Jenkins for QA automation? How can Docker help in cross-browser testing for QA? What is a Docker volume and why it is important? How do you run database containers? What's the difference between Docker PS and Docker images? How do you remove unused containers and images to save disk space? How do you use Docker for API testing? What are some Docker commands every QA should know? How to handle environment variables in Docker for QA tests? Okay, and in the next section we have discussed about the basic CLI command line and Linux commands. Okay, so what is CLI? That's the command line interface, and why should QA engineers know about it? How do you list files and directories in Linux? How do you check your current directory? How do you change the directories? How do you create a new directory? How do you create a new file from CLI? How do you view the contents of a file? How do you search inside a file for a keyword? How do you copy, move and delete files from Linux? How do you see running process? How do you check disk space usage? How do you check memory usage? How do you monitor logs in real time? How do you find a file in Linux? How to check for network connectivity? Okay, and in the next section we have discussed about the artificial intelligence. Okay, what is AI? How AI helps in traditional automation? What is machine learning? What are some AI powered tools? What is self-healing in AI automation? How does AI help in defect prediction? What is visual testing? How can AI help in exploratory testing? What are the challenges of using AI? How can AI be used in log analysis? What is AI based test case prioritization? How does AI help in test coverage analysis? How can AI help in CI/CD pipeline? What is the role of NLP in AI? In AI QA tools, how can AI handle flaky tests? What is predictive analytics? How does AI support performance testing? Can AI generate test data automatically? How does AI improve regression testing? How can AI help in root cause analysis? What is anomaly detection? How can AI integrate with Selenium? What are AI limitations in QA? What is an AI driven defect management system? What skills should a QA engineer know about AI testing? Okay, and next set of interview questions are based on tricky and miscellaneous. How do you decide when to stop testing? What's the difference between verification and validation? And what do you do if a developer rejects your defect? How do you test something without requirements? What is the defect severity and priority? How do you test a feature when the environment is unstable? What would you test in a elevator? How do you ensure your test cases are effective? How would you test a login page beyond normal credentials? How do you test without UI? How do you approach testing when timelines are very tight? How to know if your testing is good enough? Can you give an example of a bug what is that is hard to reproduce and how to handle? How do you prioritize test cases? How to handle intermittent issues? What's the difference between smoke and sanity testing? How do you handle changing requirements? What is escape defect? How do you test performance for a web app? What is the most challenging bug you found and how did you debug it? Okay, and in the next module we have spoken about the real-time QA engineer scenario. How do you test an e-commerce website like Amazon or Flipkart? How many test cases will you write to test an e-commerce site usually? And then what if an API request passes but UI fails? And if a bug is not accepted by developer, how do you convince them? What is your pull request? What if your pull request is not approved for merging and how will you handle it? How do you test add to cart functionality in an e-commerce app? How do you handle a situation where high severity bug is found just before the release? How do you test API rate limiting, that's throttling? How do you test if email notifications are sent after order confirmation? How do you ensure automation scripts are stable and not flaky? If production issue is reported but you didn't catch in testing, how do you handle it? How do you test multi-currency payment in an e-commerce site? How do you test search functionality with filters? If two developers raise bugs on each other's code, how do you handle it? How do you test mobile responsiveness of a e-commerce site? How do you handle a failed automation build in Jenkins? How do you prioritize test cases when release deadline is short? How do you test refund flow in e-commerce? How do you test when multiple users access same product stock? How do you test security in login? How do you test user registration with mobile number and email? How do you test forgot forward password functionality? How do you test file upload functionality? How do you test payment refund timeline? How do you test a shopping cart when multiple tabs are open? How do you test search suggestions? How do you handle if a developer says it's working on my machine? How would you test add to wishlist functionality? How would you test multi-user login sessions? How would you test performance of product search API? And how do you test cross-browser compatibility? How do you test product price calculation? How do you test API timeout handling? How do you handle priority versus severity conflicts in bugs? How do you test order cancellation flow? How do you test apply promo code functionality? How do you test order cracking system? How do you test login with social media? How do you test checkout process with multiple payment models? And how do you test caching? How do you test if an API response schema changes? How do you test database data integrity after placing an order? How do you test API error codes? How do you test database rollback if a transaction fails? How do you test API pagination? How do you test API automation scripts in parallel execution? How do you test CI/CD pipeline for automation tests? How do you test if API caching is implemented correctly? How do you test SQL injection vulnerability? How do you test automation framework stability? How do you test API authentication? And how do you test CI/CD rollback mechanism? How do you test if automation test data is reusable or not? And how do you test API concurrency issues? How do you test Jenkins pipeline scheduling? How do you test data migration when moving from old DB to new DB? How do you test performance of automation framework? How do you test data encryption in API or the DB? Okay. How do you test log generation in applications? How do you test rollback in automation framework if test fails? Okay. And the real-time QA scenario questions. Okay, in Agile, what will you do if developers deliver a user story very late in the sprint? How do you test if acceptance criteria is unclear in a story? If you found a bug during the sprint demo, how will you handle it? How do you handle a developer who always rejects your bug as not a bug? How do you test a user story that has dependencies on other teams? If product owner insists on releasing with a known bug, what will you do? How do you estimate testing efforts in Agile? How do you handle blocker bug in the middle of the sprint? How do you test when requirements keep changing? How do you report testing process in Agile? If you miss testing a scenario and it fails in production, how will you handle it? How do you convince management to give more time for testing? How do you test bug fixes quickly in Agile? How do you test a feature with no documentation? How do you manage test cases in Agile? How do you test sprint deliverables in very short time? How do you handle conflicts with developer? How do you test agile user stories that don't fit in one sprint? How do you test when development and QA environments differ? How do you test when multiple teams deliver microservices in parallel? How will you test cart abandonment recovery in an e-commerce site? How will you test prices updates when product goes on sale? How do you ensure test cases cover edge scenarios for payment gateway? If a stakeholder rejects your bug saying not reproducible, how will you handle? How do you test an OTP based system? What if API response is slow but UI has no timeout handling? How will you test localization of an e-commerce website with multi-language? How do you test performance of bulk order processing? If development team doesn't approve your PR merge for automation, how do you convince? How do you test coupons or discount codes? How do you test concurrency when multiple users update cart at the same time? How do you ensure data consistencies across UI, API, DB? How do you test wishlist feature in e-commerce? How do you handle flakiness in automation scripts? How do you test email notifications for order confirmation? What if business says a bug is minor but you think it's a critical? How do you test order cancellation? How do you test search functionality? How do you test stock management in inventory system? Okay, and how do you test a new feature rollout using A or alpha or beta testing? Okay guys, this is a very important document which contains almost everything to face the interviews. I have given this link in the description and also in the comment box. Please do check out, it's really helpful for interviews. Let me know if you have any queries or questions in the comment box or drop me an email. Thank you so much for watching my video. All the best for your upcoming interview. Happy learning, happy testing. Thank you.